Now I'm thrilled to introduce today's speaker. Today's speaker is Glenn Sterner. Glenn is an assistant professor of criminal justice at Penn State Abington. As an expert on the opioid epidemic, he sits on the Opioid Overdose Task Force for the state of Pennsylvania. He is also a founding member of the Penn State Consortium to Combat Substance Abuse Advisory Board and an affiliated faculty of the Criminal Justice Research Center. He's also the founder of the Share Your Opioid Story initiative. He has been awarded over $4 million in local, state, and federal grants to study and address the opioid epidemic. His work includes the examination of opioid use networks, illegal opiate distribution, networks of legitimate opioid distribution, and overdose deaths, hotspots of opioid availability, intelligence-based intervention in rural areas, and stigma associated with opioid substance abuse disorders. Please help me in welcoming today's Huddle expert, Glenn Sterner.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you.
Well, good morning. Oh, I'm glad to see everyone's awake and you already are ready to participate. So, my name is Glenn Sterner, and I'm an assistant professor of criminal justice at Penn State Abington. But most importantly, I'm an alum of Penn State, class of 2015. It's really great to be here. I came here to Penn State, so while I'm now over in Philadelphia, it's always really great to be back here in State College because I came to Penn State in 2010, so I've been with the university now for nearly a decade, and it's been one of the best experiences of my life, as I'm sure it has been for all of you, so it's really great to be able to talk to you today. Thank you so much to the Alumni Association, right? What a great group of people to be able to have us here, to be able to talk about really important issues in our communities across Pennsylvania, across the Commonwealth, and frankly, across our country. And so today, we're going to talk a little bit about drugs. It's not always the most easy conversation to have, but it's one that we certainly need to be having, especially here in Pennsylvania, and especially here at Penn State, because we have an incredible group of faculty members, staff, as well as students who are working on this critical issue in our communities across the Commonwealth. And so, we're going to talk about the opioid crisis, right? I am one of those professors who likes to have a lot of interaction, so I hope you're ready. And I know that I see that most of you probably have only been out of the classroom about 1 or 2 years. So I expect that you understand how this works. So before we get into it, I want to just let you know what we're going to talk about today. First of all, I just want to let you know, there's some basic stuff that most people probably are not aware of. You probably hear about the opioid crisis in the news. You might hear about it as we think about this in the context of your community, some of the things that are going on across the country, perhaps. And so let's talk about the basics. Let's start from there. So what are the opioids? What are we actually talking about here, right? And then where do they actually come from? These are two questions that most of the time we don't typically talk about. And then what I really want us to dive a little bit deeper on is, how is it affecting our communities in the United States? But let's come right home to Pennsylvania. How is it affecting our communities right here at home? And then I was just telling Paul that I'm actually really happy to be talking with you about this today, because most times I have to give a lot of bad news in the work that I do, because as you heard, I do a lot of work on the opioid crisis and drugs and drug trafficking. But today I'm actually here to give you a little bit of good news, because we know that there are some things that are working, which is really excellent to know. And then finally, we're going to follow up with some other things that you should be thinking about and where it is that you might be able to get some help, right? Whether that's you or a family member or somebody that you know that might need some assistance. So first of all, what are these things? What are opioids? Let's hear from you all. What have you heard? What are opioids? What do you know about this? What are some names you might have heard? Oxycontin. We're just talking about this. I'm sure you're seeing all these settlements kind of coming out of Oklahoma, etc. What other things are opioids? Fentanyl, exactly. So we're hearing a lot about fentanyl in our communities. What else?
Tylenol with codeine.
Tylenol with codeine. Codeine actually is an opioid, absolutely. Other things?
Heroin.
Heroin, exactly. So We are probably more familiar with the legitimate use of opioids, prescription opioid painkillers. Before I get into it, you might hear opioids and opiates. What are the difference? Opiates naturally derive from the poppy plant. Opioids means that they've been changed by chemistry in some way, shape, or form. That's the only difference. So you typically hear those two terms used interchangeably, and that's the only reason why. So we started using opioids because it's a little bit better of a catch-all. So prescription opioid painkillers, codeine, Percocet, OxyContin, those types of things, these are utilized for legitimate means. Even fentanyl is utilized for a legitimate mean. You might think of it as like a fentanyl patch. You might have to use it on your, for example, like for arthritis, those types of things. We know that these have legitimate uses for pain management, both acute and long-term. And then there's heroin. And so this is what actual heroin looks like. I myself am from Michigan. Don't hold that against me. But I come from a really small town in Michigan. When I came to Penn State, I got my Ph.D. in rural sociology. And I was doing work out in communities across Pennsylvania and Michigan still for the research that I was doing to get my degree. And they started talking to me about this heroin problem that they were noting. This is 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I couldn't believe it, coming from a really small rural farm town, that we were having this issue. But this was making its way into our communities, and so ever since then, I've been dedicated to addressing this critical community issue here in Pennsylvania, but across the country. But this is what heroin looks like. The picture on the top, the whiter the heroin, the more pure it is. The darker it is, the more impurities it has. And the darker it is, if you utilize those substances, the higher likelihood you're going to have some harm associated with that, right? So these things going in your body, not a good thing. And then finally, fentanyl. You're right. This is a really talked about issue. We hear it all the time, how people are overdosing from fentanyl, whether that's contact or whether that is actual use within these substances that they're putting in their body. Fentanyl can be put into tab format, so you might not necessarily know that that's what you're getting. It can also be mixed in with heroin. It can also be this other substance called carfentanil. That's on the bottom there. And so why do we care about this stuff? Why do we care to know the different types? Well, this is why. So when we start to think about lethal amounts of these drugs and these substances, if you look at heroin, you can actually see that in that little vial there, that's what would typically be a lethal dose for a normal human being of average body weight and age. Fentanyl is in the middle. You can still see a few crystals in there, but a much smaller amount that can actually kill you. And then all the way over to carfentanil, 1 grain. If you get 1 grain within the substances that you're taking, you might not necessarily know this, it can actually kill you. Carfentanil is actually utilized as a large animal tranquilizer. So it does actually have a legitimate use as well. But the problem, though, is that it's getting mixed into certain things. So where do they come from? We just talked about what these actually are, but where do they come from? What have you heard? Where do you know that opioids come from? Where does heroin come from?
Poppies.
Poppies. So yes, poppies is where it comes from, but where in the world does it come from? China, the Far East. Yeah, so we know that traditionally Afghanistan and India are the world's largest producer of heroin, but where does it come for us here in the United States?
Colombia.
It used to be Colombia. It's now Mexico. Mexico is one of the largest producers, and this has changed over time, of controlled substances in the United States. So when we start, not controlled substances, very specifically heroin in the United States. When we think about the largest amounts of prescription opioid painkillers coming into our communities, the largest amounts are coming from hydrocodone and oxycodone. Morphine's also within there, but again, here's some good news. This number is going down. We are working through various programs like prescription drug monitoring programs. If you have a prescription drug, you have to work with your pharmacy or your physician to make sure that those things are not being doctor shopped, are making sure that we're keeping track of who's getting access to these things. And because of that, our numbers are going down. And that has happened, this is 2017, 2018 is actually even lower. So good news there, right? So some of these policies are working. We are reducing the amount of painkillers out into our communities. Well, with regards to heroin, we see that in the beginning, so if you look across, this green here is Mexico. And so for a long time, we were getting a little bit of it, and part of it was coming from South America, but over the past several years, we see that Mexico has been the world's the largest contributor to heroin in the United States. So we know that it's coming from those places. But the problem, though, is that it's really hard to interdict. And this is perhaps why. Where do we get fentanyl from? China. Yes, I hear some rumblings out there. China is where we get most of our fentanyl from, but it doesn't always come directly from China. It can come through Canada, and it can come through Mexico. And so what happens is that fentanyl, heroin, and other substances are shipped in different shipments. For fentanyl, I like to say that the United States Postal Service is the world's largest drug trafficker. You probably don't even know this, but it's actually true. More drugs come through the mail than any other form, especially fentanyl. So a brick, it looks actually like a brick. It's about this size. Can be shipped from China to here or routed through Mexico or Canada, and it can get to our communities. And that small little brick can give millions of dollars in profits. And that's an unfortunate experience because it can also kill many, many people, right? And so it's really, really hard for us to find every single way that it's coming into our communities. And believe me, I work with our local police, I work with our state police, I work with our federal government agencies. These people are trying incredibly hard to find ways to disrupt these supplies, but it is really difficult to do. And so what we're doing at Penn State is finding ways to continue to explore ways to increase the knowledge of local police, but also state police and federal agencies, which is kind of exciting for us to say that we're helping with this problem. So that's a lot of information so far. Why don't we take just a couple of brief questions, if you have them. And I think that we've got our line ambassadors out there with some microphones, so it's easier for all of us to hear. Going right here. So the question is, can dogs smell it, and can it be interdicted that way? So yes, so canines can be trained to make sure that they can smell it, can sniff it out. But again, it's really hard when you have quite literally millions of packages coming through every day. So for example, in JFK Airport, you have 200 million or so packages coming from China a day. And so it's really difficult for us to check every single one of those packages, especially if they're very small packages, right? But yes, that's one way to do that. There's a question over there?
The manufactured pharmaceutical and heroin.
Yeah.
What's the percentage?
Well, so the question is, what's the relationship between manufacturers of legitimate prescription opioid painkillers and heroin, right? So we know that the opioid crisis was fueled a lot by the glut of prescription opioid painkillers that came on the market in the 80s and 90s, and even to some extent today. And because of that, we know that that was fueled, that the issue of substance use disorder, the issue of addiction, was fueled by this. There's no direct relationship as far as the producers of prescription opioid painkillers and heroin, but we do know that those people saw this market, the producers of heroin, the people who are selling heroin in communities, saw this market opening up. They recognized that people were becoming addicted to these prescription opioid painkillers, and they saw an opportunity to, frankly, take advantage of our communities and the people that live within them.
So what percentage of the opioid problem can people who are addicted cause prescriptions?
I'm about to show you a chart to tell you exactly that. But in the beginning, we like to think of it in terms of waves. So in the beginning, it was mostly prescription opioid painkillers. That number has waned over time. Then we saw an increase in overdose deaths associated with heroin. And that was the largest for a good portion of time. And in the past 2 to 3 to 4 years, we've seen this increase in overdose deaths associated with fentanyl. So these synthetics, these really strong, potent substances that are getting mixed in with heroin, that are getting mixed in with other substances, and that's what's been happening. I'm going to take one more question, and then we're going to move on. Go right ahead.
I was thinking in terms of the problem. Did you look at the legitimate distribution of these? the Washington Post had the Opioid Files project that's been ongoing for a couple of months. And a small rural local pharmacy in Bedford County sold over nearly 1,200,000 opioid pills in a 5-year period. Didn't people think something's wrong? In a county of 40,000, you have a locally owned pharmacy that sells over 1 million opioid pills. I mean, have you looked at that? I mean, is that, maybe it's legal, but was it legitimate? Was it ethical? And what's the relationship between that and the so-called, and the problem now?
Absolutely. So the question that he was talking about is where we see these pharmacies in these locations where they were simply pumping out pills into the community on a really regular basis. We call those pill mills, right? And so pill mills really came from southern Ohio, West Virginia, and to some extent southwestern Pennsylvania. So we see that these have been made their way into our communities. Yes. The question is, that was legitimate, legally, I should say. That was legally legitimate to do because they had these physicians who were unscrupulously prescribing and providing these substances out to their patients that probably were not using them for acute or chronic pain management, right? We know that they were likely abusing them. And so because of that, we were having a continuous issue where this is providing a large amount of these substances into our communities. Some of you may actually have received some of these prescription opioid painkillers for a prescription, for a surgery, for arthritis, those types of things, right? What happens when you don't need all of them, right? I broke my nose several years ago and I got an entire bottle of roughly 60 Percocet. I don't need 60 Percocet. I took 2 and I dispose of the rest. But many people keep those in their cabinets, keep them in their homes for long periods of times, and that's what that amount of substances out in our communities has really helped to fuel this substance use issue across America. So let's talk a little bit about how it's actually affecting our communities. Like I said, I'm going to start us out with some good news. The good news is that our numbers, if you see this curve, so this line here is overdose deaths in the United States 1999 from 2014 to 2018. And these are preliminary numbers that we're getting into for 2018, but if you start to see, it's starting to actually go down. This is the first time that we've actually seen these numbers decrease writ large in the country since the beginning of the opioid crisis. They've been creeping up ever since. But we're finally seeing that they are going down because roughly 120 people are dying per day of an opioid, of a drug overdose in the United States. That's too many. And so that's why we need to continue to be focused on this because, frankly, this number, it needs to go down much, much further. This is still larger than homicides. This is still larger than car accidents. These people are dying all across our communities, all across our country. So, as I mentioned before, there is a whole host of different substances that are contributing to this. In the beginning, you saw that blue line. That's prescription opioid painkillers. That increased over time. So just what you're talking about, it increased over time, but has essentially flattened out. We then saw this huge line, this green line here. We saw that increase over time, right? And that's only been in the last several years, but that was because of these street dealers who have taken advantage of our substance use issue here in America, fueled by the prescription opioid crisis. And then finally, we're now seeing this integration of these other substances, synthetics. That's the most deadly substance. And so as we start to look at what's contributing to the decline in our actual overdose death rates, we've actually seen heroin tick off. They're actually decreasing. So that's a good sign for us. Heroin deaths are decreasing in the United States and Pennsylvania. Also, prescription opioid painkiller deaths decreasing. But what is not decreasing is fentanyl. Fentanyl continues to give us an issue. And it's because we see it's being mixed in with other substances like cocaine and methamphetamine. And so when you think that you're getting something else, you actually are getting a very different substance and it kills you. Yeah?
Why are doctors prescribing this? Are they idiots?
So the question is, why are doctors prescribing this? Are they idiots? Well, so I will talk very briefly about this. I will give the caveat that I'm not a physician. I am a social scientist, I'm a criminologist, but what we do know is that during the 80s to 90s, pain became what was known as the fifth vital sign. The goal was to make sure that you didn't feel any pain. And a really good way to do that is to give you a lot of opioids, right? And so in order for us to make sure that you didn't feel any pain within the medical establishment, they were using this as an acute as well as chronic pain management. But this was fueled by, frankly, poor science. The drug manufacturers were utilizing this message, utilized by this very small study that was not scientifically backed, indicating that opioids were not addictive. And so they were peddling these substances across our entire medical establishment, citing this work that was actually incorrect. And this is the importance of science. This is the importance of making sure that you have individuals who are continuously keeping their eye on the work that we're doing out in our communities. And this is why it's really important that you support not just Penn State and our faculty members and students here, but frankly, other scientists across the world. Important to note is that this is more affecting men than women. Men are overdosing at higher death rates than women are. And actually, it has decreased the life expectancy of men in America. For one of the very few first times in our history, we are now seeing life expectancy decrease for men, specifically in the age range of 44 to 55. Not what you would typically think. Most of the time we think of this issue of substance use as like a young person's thing, right? But it actually started out in the 35 to 44 range. Those were the highest death rates in the beginning. We then saw climbing for a good period of time, the 45 to 54 range. So these are people who are getting access to these prescription opioids, most likely through their doctors, most likely through legitimate means, and then potentially moving into other substances because they could no longer get access to them. That's what we've been finding. But then we've recently seen this uptick in nearly every other age range. So 25 to 34, 55 to 64, those are the highest rates of overdose within our country, not the youngest generation, thankfully. Right? But we have to make sure that we keep our eye on this through prevention initiatives such as Prosper through Penn State. So where is this affecting us? So let's take a look at overdose deaths over time. If you take a look at this map, you see that it's not everywhere, right? Yes, it can be in any community at any time, but important to note is that we have a really hard issue up here in the Northeast. We, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, we have been the leaders, which is not a good thing to say, in overdose deaths within this crisis for quite some time. And that's something that our university, as well as our communities, and I think, frankly, the support from our state government has been really keen to address, and thankfully they are. And particularly, this map is put together by a good friend and colleague of mine, Shannon Monnet and colleagues. This maps out the rural spaces. All you need to see here is that these different colors are different substances. Rural spaces have been more hit hard by this crisis than we ever anticipated. This is what got me interested in this issue, because I wanted to make sure that my hometown was protected or was dealing with this issue, and that we are addressing this accordingly. But we know that over time, rural spaces have seen an increase in overdose deaths more so than our urban areas, but it has caught up. Urban spaces across America, specifically if you take a look at Philadelphia, we're the #1 in overdose death rates of the largest cities in America. And so we have a responsibility to really think about how it is that we can address this, because you don't address fentanyl the same way that you address prescription opioid painkillers. There are different ways that we do this in our community. And so by understanding these fine details, we can make sure that we're addressing this in a comprehensive manner. So what about Pennsylvania specifically? What is going on? Well, we, as I have mentioned, have outpaced the United States overdose death rates, unfortunately. So that's the bad news. This is the numbers from 2017. You can see the darker the color, the more deaths that we're seeing in our communities, right? We see some very specific hotspots, places where you probably didn't even think about this, right? Very rural southwestern Pennsylvania has been incredibly hard hit by this, in these really small counties. But you also see on the other side, on the eastern side of the state, that right in Philadelphia, as well as you get up into the Scranton, Reading area, those areas have been really hard hit as well. And we've seen some success, and I'm going to sweeten the pot. I'm going to tell you that we are seeing some successes. We have, so these, the lighter the color indicates that you're actually seeing a decrease in overdose deaths over time. And this is from 2015 to 2017, and we're likely going to see better numbers in the future. Yeah, there's a question over here.
Isn't there a direct correlation between the use of Narcan now with the decrease in deaths?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's going to be one of my thankful successes is that Narcan, and we'll talk about what Narcan is, but yes, Narcan is actually helping us in these communities, thankfully, right? But what has contributed the most to Pennsylvania actually having this high amount of overdose deaths is this issue of fentanyl. So this is 2015. These are overdose deaths. Orange is heroin, yellow is fentanyl, and then the reds and the oranges, they are prescription opioid painkillers as well as other substances. You get to 2016, what happens? All yellow, nearly all yellow. And then by 2017, the entire state has been blanketed by this substance. It has made it into all of these supplies. This is what's contributing to what's going on in our community. So it's so incredibly important to understand how it is that we can keep this out of people's hands and get people into treatment. Yeah, go ahead.
So I have a question. So why would a heroin dealer place his heroin with fentanyl? It seems to me he would lose his cousin. So it doesn't make any sense.
I get this question all the time. You're killing your customer base, right? The problem is that this has increased so quickly, the sales of heroin, the sales of what have you, is that these dealers no longer know what is going on in their communities. So before, this is going to sound very strange, but they were looking out for their communities. They were looking out for the people that they were selling to. And I've spoke to people who have actually dealt these substances. And in the beginning, these folks were selling prescription opioid painkillers because they thought it was safe. They thought it was safe. They said, it's a pill, it's coming from a doctor, it can't be that bad. What happened, though, is that over time, they were getting these supplies in from people that they didn't necessarily know. And so they don't actually sometimes know what they're selling. So when we start to think about Pennsylvania, though, again, I have some actual good news. We've seen these numbers go down over the past roughly since May 2017, end of 2017, we start to see them creep down. But we cannot give up. We cannot let this think that we have beaten this crisis because most likely what this is being contributed to is the use of, frankly, Narcan. So we have to make sure that we are continuing to work here at Penn State and in our communities all across the country. So why do we care about when we start to think about these different substances? Why do we care if we know that you are a prescription opioid painkiller user, a heroin user, or potentially somebody who is utilizing fentanyl? Why do we care? Hold on just one second. And the reason for this is because we know, based on some of the research that I do with my colleagues, that people are being affected by their use patterns. People who are utilizing these substances are having tons of negative effects. They are getting in trouble with the law. They might have physical, mental, or relationship problems. It's disrupting their lives. They are having issues getting to school, getting to work. And this is just attributed to their prescription opioid painkiller experience. So we know that if we can help to prevent even them utilizing those substances, that's great. But what we really want to do is stop them from moving into heroin, because it can sometimes double those negative effects. It can actually increase their chances of getting in trouble with the law, which makes sense, right? Because that's more of an illicit substance. It's harder to get access to. But if we can stop them, if we can find ways to get them into treatment, the folks that need that help to address this disease that they're going through, that yes, we can prevent some of these issues. And so when we are working in our communities, we need to understand that we need to talk about this. Because if you don't ask your friends, and if you don't ask your family, if you don't ask your neighbors what it is that they could use your assistance with, they might be going into that road of moving into illicit heroin and illicit substances, and that's what we're trying to prevent. So what's working? Okay.
If someone is hooked on prescription medication, is it really cheaper for them then to switch to a heroin product instead of using a prescription product?
Yeah, so the question is, if you are using prescription opioid painkillers, and you have a substance use disorder that is keeping you addicted to these substances, is it really cheaper to go to heroin? How much do you think one pill on the market costs to buy, on the black market? $40. You are correct. So it can be... That was a loaded question, wasn't it? She guessed right. No, in actuality, these substances can go from $30 to $60 to potentially $90 per pill. I have talked to people who have utilized upwards of 30 pills a day. 30 pills a day. That adds up very, very quickly. I just talked to this wonderful woman who is, and I'll let you know about this project that we're working on right now, but she was talking about her substance use. She only used prescription opioid painkillers. She never moved into heroin, but she was driving around every single day, going from doctor to doctor to doctor, pharmacy to pharmacy to pharmacy, because she was driven by the physical withdrawals that she could potentially go through by utilizing these substances. So when you go through withdrawals, the only thing that you want to do is to make sure that you don't feel that. And so in order, if you don't have enough money for that $60, $90, you can go and utilize, sometimes in desperation, heroin, unfortunately. And that heroin, you don't know what's going to be in it, but it can be as cheap as $6 to $10 per use. So 60 to 90 versus $6 to $9. Incredibly cheaper. And so yes, it is a much cheaper experience. And the reason that it's getting cheaper is by the lacing of it with fentanyl. So these people are utilizing these other cheaper substances. So fentanyl itself is a very cheap product. It comes from a lab. It never comes from a poppy. It is a substance entirely created, and it can actually be manufactured right in a facility. And most of the time, as I've mentioned before, it comes from China. And because of that, it's exceptionally cheap. And so the cheaper that is, the cheaper it is when you get it out actually to the consumer of that substance. Yeah?
Question in terms of how does the addiction occur?
Mm-hmm.
My understanding is fentanyl and heroin, in your brain, you have something called the happiness area. The heroin or fentanyl kills the happiness area immediately, so the only way you become happy is to take the drugs. And so you continue over time, and it happens immediately. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, that's exactly the way that it's typically working. So it doesn't necessarily knock out that happy receptor. What it does is it hijacks it, right? So what's actually happening there is that you take these substances and you feel no pain. It washes all of that pain away. And so for a period of time, you feel really great, right? So it helps to raise that happy threshold. But when you stop using it, it's harder to get back to that same level over and over and over. And so it takes more and more of those substances in order to feel potentially just normal over time, because it can reduce your ability to produce those naturally occurring hormones and those naturally occurring substances within your body in order to make sure that you're feeling like a normal human being. And so what happens is that's how that addiction comes hold. That's how dependency comes part of this process. So you might be actually physically dependent on this, where you don't want, like we were talking about here, where you actually might feel withdrawal symptoms, so that dependency occurs over time. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are addicted. Addicted very specifically indicates that you're doing these things that are potentially harmful to you and your person and potentially to others, and you can't control that anymore. And so it's beyond your control because your brain has been hijacked. And that's why it's important to recognize that this is really a brain disease. It's not necessarily a physical thing, but it is really a brain disease that is occurring over time, and that the only way to address it is through, frankly, getting into treatment and getting the resources that you need in order to make sure that you can work through this issue. Yeah, there's a question over here.
How does Narcan and Suboxone cure?
I will get right in. That's actually the next slide up here. I will get right into that. Go right ahead.
Has your research shown how marijuana factors into this complex relationship?
Yeah, so this is a question that I think that we're all having, right? So marijuana is a really complicated subject matter because right now on the federal level, it is still illegal. But we know that in some states, it's actually they're considering it legal to be able to gain access to, both from the potential recreational use all the way to just for medical use. And so this is complicating us in order to be able to measure this. Frankly, it's not really clear. We do have some indication that some people are utilizing marijuana in order to wean themselves off of opioids, or there's other opportunities for people to utilize marijuana instead of opioids, rather than moving into, say, from prescription opioids into heroin, they might move into marijuana. And so there is indication that people are moving to those substances, but frankly, because of the complicated nature, it's really, really difficult to measure this on a, I would say, definitive answer right now. We will probably know that in the next 2 to 3 years. Go right ahead.
How easy is it to manufacture fentanyl? Are you starting to see like home labs like they have for meth labs?
So I will let you know that I myself am not manufacturing fentanyl. I am not Breaking Bad, so let's just put that out there. So the question is, how easy is it to create fentanyl? It's not that easy, right? And so you have to, it's not as easy as, say, meth. So we don't actually see the homegrown fentanyl happening in, say, like the United States that we saw with those like one-pot methamphetamine labs that you might have heard about. Most of it is still from China because it's just so cheap to get it from someplace else. So what's working? I've been asked about this a couple times. So naloxone/Narcan is what you can utilize to reverse the overdose effects of an opioid. It actually, if you use it, this is what it looks like. It's a nasal spray. You can also get it injected, but most of the time what you're seeing now is this nasal spray. And it comes in this very small little container, and if you see somebody that is going through an overdose, you squirt it into their nostril. Sometimes it may take more than one dose to reverse, especially if that person is being affected by fentanyl, so it may take you 2, and I've heard that from other colleagues that they've had to use potentially 4 and 5 doses in order to revive a person. But what it does is it helps to make sure that that person can function again. It reverses that overdose effect. It restores breathing in about 2 to 5 minutes, roughly, so it's not going to be like immediate, right? It takes a little bit of time to kick in. And the reason that you need to make sure that you're connecting with emergency medical services as soon as you administer this, actually before you administer this, call them, because it can only reverse that effect for 30 to 90 minutes. It's not like it's just going to solve that issue for that person. You have to make sure that they get into treatment, and they have to make sure that they get to acute care to make sure that they're okay. To note, this isn't new. This is not a new drug. It's been available for over 40 years. This is something that's been on the market for a long time. But we are utilizing it more because of this acute critical issue within our community of overdoses happening because of opioids. In Pennsylvania, there's a standing order from the Physician General, Dr. Rachel Levine. She has provided the opportunity for anybody in this audience to get access to naloxone so that if you come across somebody who needs help, you can do it. And it's also covered underneath our Good Samaritan Act. So let's say you are doing something that perhaps is not legal, and your friend may be going underneath some sort of an overdose. You can call 911, any emergency services, and you'll be fine. The important piece here is that they will not prosecute you. You need to get that person help, especially if they are overdosing. Stay there with that person. Stay there. Make sure that the EMS understands what's going on. Make sure that you're giving them all the information that you can. That is really incredibly important. And so because of the Good Samaritan Act, you cannot be prosecuted. You will not be prosecuted for that experience. So that's what I want to make sure that you all know, that this naloxone experience, it's important for you to make sure that you, A, know about it. And likely, this is what we have seen because we've seen such an increase of availability of naloxone across our entire Commonwealth, that's likely what we're seeing is reducing these overdose deaths. But we also know that we've done a really incredible job here in Pennsylvania, that we've been get greater access to treatment. Treatment is also really important here. So let's say you reverse this overdose, but what next? There is an increased availability for people to get access to medically assisted treatment. This is Suboxone, this is Vivitrol, this is Methadone. Those are the gold standards as it comes to people getting into treatment in order to make sure that they are addressing their substance use disorder. We know that they have the highest rates of success. We know this. Penn State Health, Penn State Hershey, they are helping to lead the way in all of this work to make sure that people get access to this through our PACMAT model here in Pennsylvania. They are doing this work out in communities. We have centers of excellence that are helping to connect people to the resources that they need in communities all across Pennsylvania. And it's frankly been really excellent to be able to connect to colleagues who are saving lives every single day. Penn State is leading the charge in this, and it's really exciting to see. In addition to that, we also need to make sure that we're not forgetting about those substances already in our communities. There are these things. They're called drop boxes. There are opioid take-back boxes, sometimes what they're called. There's opioid take-back day. One is coming up here in October. I forget the actual date. I should know that off the top of my head. But you, in most of the communities across the entire Commonwealth, can take your substances, no questions asked, drop it into this drop box, and they are then incinerated by the National Guard. They work with the Attorney General's office to make sure that it's entirely secure. Police are there to make sure that these things are taken care of. What's that? October 26th. Make sure you're looking out for those dates. We are working with local communities to, again, find ways to connect these ways that we can get these substances out of our communities and couple that with prevention efforts in communities across Pennsylvania, again, through some of the work of our colleagues here at Penn State. So we recognize the opportunity associated with getting these substances out of our communities, getting it out of the hands of anybody who could potentially misuse them. So make sure that you're dropping those substances off. In addition, we're also working with our state police colleagues as well as our local police colleagues to find ways to refine opportunities to increase our capacity to disrupt these markets. It's not enough just to do preventative work. We need to know that we're doing our education in our communities to make sure that people understand what these substances are and that they have negative effects and that you should not use them, right? We need to do that. We also need to make sure that we are continuing to gain access to treatment. That is incredibly important for those people with an active substance use disorder. And importantly, that first time might not help. You might have to go back 2 to 3, and I've talked to others who've gone through it several times, but now they're on the other side of it, and now they're working out in our communities to make sure that they are addressing this issue accordingly. And then the third is working with interdiction, disrupting those supplies, getting those supplies out of our communities, whether that's through take-back boxes or whether that's through the police, making sure that we are disrupting those supplies and not just low-level dealers on the street, but really thinking about how it is that we can disrupt those supplies so that they're not coming through the mail, so that they're not coming from Mexico, so that it's not coming through China. And that's what we're doing here at Penn State, which is really exciting to say.
Can you tell us what Penn State is doing on its various campuses to try to, first of all, keep students from falling into these habits, and second of all, to help them, like if they're in an overdose, do the campus police know how to use these things and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, what are we doing to make sure that Penn State students are being protected, right? And getting the help that they need. What is really exciting is that we at Penn State have across multiple campuses at this point, we have opportunities for people to get into recovery. It's called Lions for Recovery. There's one here at University Park. We have one at Penn State Abington. One of the students that I work with is helping to lead that charge. And what happens with that is these are support mechanisms to make sure that those students stay in recovery. It's not important just to get in recovery, but how do we make sure that we stay in recovery? And so if you're looking to support these kids, that's a way to do that. We also make sure that, yes, of course, all of our police are trained according to all of our standards with regards to naloxone. They are armed and ready to go in any situation. I have the utmost confidence in our campus police here at University Park, but we have some really great people at Abington as well. And so one thing that I want to make sure that we're also focusing on is activity of you. the work that you're doing out in communities does matter, and the work that of our community members also matters. One thing that we know that is working is coalition work, making sure that all those three things that I just talked about, prevention, treatment, and interdiction, that those things are getting to the people that need it because of community coalitions. And it's because of people like Jesse.
A lot of times my family thinks I'm crazy. My children growing up, they would say, you don't want to mess with my mom because she brings people into our house. My mother always says, I think you're going to end up in the streets dying all the time. I have a sense that this is something that is within, so deep, even though they think I'm crazy, even though they're like, how she does all this stuff, everything. You never get tired of doing for others, as long as you're doing it with a pure heart. My name is Jessie Alejandro, and this is my story. When I was growing up, I knew that some of my family members were on drugs. I wouldn't say anything because, we just keep our mouth quiet and keep walking, but I was hurt because I loved my family. I wanted to help them and I didn't know how to help them. I didn't want to raise my children in that environment. It affected me so much that I decided that I needed to go. But it seemed to be that no matter where I went, it was somebody that was always using. I always connected with that person that was using me. Something inside of me, it was like, just talk to them. As my kids were growing older, I would go out with them and tell them, let's go to the community and feed. Seeing people, it reminded me of my family. I wanted to give them something to eat and talk to them. And then at the same time, I wanted to educate my kids. I want to say, this destroys families and some people will reject you and people push you to the side. But we can never do that to anybody. We want to make sure that we always embrace people no matter how they look. As time went by, it just became such a passion to serve the community. One of the things that we do, we started this Thanksgiving feast. Throughout the years, it started to grow and grow. 2 years ago, we fed 2,500 people. It started to also grow in volunteers. People wanted to come and help serve. And I used to say, well, if you want to do something, this is an opportunity, you come, but you have to cook. Because I wanted them to feel what it is to serve somebody who's out in the streets. When you see it and you say, okay, let me stop and find out what's going on, then you're able to connect and try to help the person or whoever it may be that needs help at that time. It makes me feel proud to see someone change a life. It's a mother instinct. I guess that's why we call our ministry Mother's Mission, because when a child is born, the mother picks up the child and wants to embrace the child, want to lift the child up, right? You want to make sure that the child has clothes, and you want to make sure that the child has a place, to sleep, and you want to make sure that child has something to eat. When I think about all these things, I say, I have learned so much. Though they think that they learned from me, I have learned from them. Because they're the one who taught me what it is to love people, to have compassion for people, to have understanding for them. They're the one who has taught me to listen. They're the one who has really taught me the many things that I've learned throughout the years in Philadelphia.
Jesse, like many other people across our Commonwealth, I'll get to you, are really making sure that we're taking what has been going on and turning it into action. I've been so fortunate to be part of this initiative that we have started at Penn State called the Share Your Opioid Story Initiative, that we're hoping to address some of the issues of stigma. Because as Jesse talked about, what happens is we don't talk about this. And so that's why I was so excited to be able to come and talk to you all today about this really important issue, because the more that we talk about this, the more likely it is that we can get people into the treatment that they need, get people the help that they need, make sure that the issues that are going on in our community can be addressed. And so we've been talking with people, and I've sat down with over 50 people from across Pennsylvania and beyond, hearing about how their stories, the ways in which that they've been affected, whether they've lost a loved one, whether they have lost a friend, whether they themselves have gone through this experience and are now in recovery from the disease of substance use disorder, or they themselves are taking this out into action, where they're supporting loved ones and supporting the community. And what I've found is an incredible group of people that are so incredibly willing to act and take action within our communities, and it's an opportunity for us to think about this beyond the current opioid crisis, but thinking about it for the future. And frankly, what Jesse helps us see, as well as all the other people, is that there is hope, and that I'm really happy to be able to say that it is working, and that we need to continue forward accordingly. So real quick before we wrap up, what else should we be thinking about? This is not just an opioid crisis. This is a substance use crisis. More people are using cocaine, more people are using methamphetamines, and fentanyl is getting mixed into these substances every single day. So we have to make sure that we are keeping our eye on that, and that we are addressing this comprehensively through multiple ways throughout our communities. We cannot be giving up. We can't think that we've fixed this problem. And so if you or anybody else you know needs help, there's a hotline you can call. It's available to anybody in Pennsylvania, and each individual state has their own hotlines at this point, and there's also a national hotline. There's opportunities through 1-800-662-HELP. They can even connect you to other people if you need it. We have an incredible group of people at the Pennsylvania Department of Drug and Alcohol Programs, one of our huge partners and huge supporters of Penn State's efforts to do this work, and a partner in the Share Your Opioid Story initiative, which is right there if you are interested in learning more. There's also work being done at the federal level through the CDC and SAMHSA that you can also tap into. But with that, I want to give a couple more minutes. I know that we've taken some questions throughout, but I just want to really thank you. Thank you for taking the time to come out and hear about this issue that is affecting communities all across Pennsylvania, all across our country. This can happen to any one of us. Any single one of us in this room, any single one of our families, any single one of our communities. This disease does not discriminate, and this is something that we all need to work together on, and this is what I'm hoping that you take away as this message, that we can do it. We are Penn State. And we at Penn State are making sure that we are taking the time to address this really critical community issue. And so, again, if you need more information, I'm happy to connect you to that. Thank you so much. We've got some questions over here. You've been so patient. Oh, right here. Oh, no. Sorry.
What's the percentage of convicted felons that are incarcerated for drug-related crimes?
So I don't actually have that number on the top of my head. The question is, what is the percentage of individuals who are now currently incarcerated due to drug-related crimes? I don't know that answer off the top of my head, unfortunately. But if you want me to, we can certainly find that information for you. It is exceptionally high, and we do know that a large amount of people with drug-related crimes are actually in prison right now.
So, do you have any thoughts on the efficacy of some of the policies that they've enacted in like Vancouver, British Columbia, and some of those things that are a little bit more experimental?
Yeah, so as a federally funded researcher, I cannot advocate for or against any policies, but I can tell you a little bit about some of the science that surrounds these policies. We do know that there are policies that do help. And given some of the research that we are engaged in at Penn State, we do know that sometimes things like, for example, prescription drug monitoring programs, while they do help initially, they can sometimes drive people into illicit markets, into illicit substances. So we are concerned about that issue. And so that's being done right here at Penn State, that research. The other types of policies that you might be talking about are safe use or safe injection site that might be a little bit more controversial controversial, especially for those of you who are from the Philadelphia region. We do know that safe use sites, safe injection sites, reduce the issues associated with bloodborne pathogens, so they reduce HIV, hepatitis, those types of disease transmissions. We do know that they reduce the risk of overdose deaths. So we do know that information. We also know about other things like syringe exchange, another controversial policy, but something that is instituted in other locations that they actually, again, reduces the opportunity for people to spread their bloodborne pathogens if they are active users. So we do know some of these things. I will say this. As we think about the ways in which that we address this issue in our communities, it's important for us to understand the science, but it's also important for us to understand the education around that science in order for people to understand what's going on in our communities. And that's what we're continuously trying to do, is help people to understand science versus perception. Yeah, go ahead.
To what extent is the Chinese government complicit in fentanyl smuggling?
So that is a loaded question. Right there. So the question is, how complicit is the Chinese government in fentanyl smuggling? So for a good portion of time, up until very recently, fentanyl was much easier to produce and manufacture in China because of the restrictions surrounding it. In the more recent years, and it's only been in the past year to 2 years, that they have continued to increase their restrictions around fentanyl sales, as well as distribution, as well as manufacturing. And so there's an important need for us to think about this in a global perspective, right? Things that are happening in other countries do matter all the way down to our communities here in Pennsylvania. And so it's important that we find ways to work with our partners and our key players across the entire world to address those substances accordingly. Yes.
Okay. I just want people to remember there are people our age that might be candidates for opioids. My mother-in-law, who lived here, had osteoporosis in her hip with referred pain to her knee. She always complained about her knee, and so her doctor gave her Tylenol with codeine or something with codeine. And they were big jars. They were about, I don't know, must have been 100, and there were 2. So we weren't living here at the time. We come up for a visit, and she's complaining, and so I'm looking for these pills. Well, they're not anywhere where she could get them. They were up high in a cupboard. And the thing is, they were there available, 2 jars, probably 100 each of this opioid. And we had home health aides that came during the week because we didn't live in Pennsylvania at the time, and we came up on weekends. So I thought, how frightening to think that these young gals who are nurses' aides have exposure to these opioids here, so in our house. So I think people have to be aware of what your setting is, who's coming in to help out, and what's available to those people also.
Absolutely, and this is the importance of understanding how to work with your physicians, and talking with your family members about the substances that they might just take for granted that they're supposed to be using, right? And so making sure you're there, if you have elderly parents, to talk with them about the questions that they're asking their physician, asking them about their history and understanding why it is that they have these substances in their house, what happens when they don't utilize all of these substances, and how do we get rid of them through things like, for example, take-back days. And so having those conversations is so incredibly important within families all across our Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and all across our country. Thank you again. This is our last question that we're going to take right now. Thank you.
So once again, a big round of applause for our presenter today, Glenn Sterner.